Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Daily Objective brought to you by the Ayn Rand Center UK. If you didn't get enough of me yesterday, you got me today. Or if you did get too much of me yesterday, too bad. I'm here again today with a great co-host, Nicolas Krusek, and we're going to be talking about conspiracy theories, their historical and philosophical roots, and how often conspiracy theories are based on a malevolent universe. Evil is power. Premises. Anybody who's seen my reality check on evil knows to some degree the objectivist perspective on evil is very, very, very different from the rest of the world's perspective on evil. So we're going to take a deep dive into this conspiracy theory stuff with Nicolas. Nicolas, I'm sure you've done a lot more thinking on this topic than I. So I want to yield the floor to you. First of all, tell us what a conspiracy theory is. Why don't we start with a basic definition?
All right. Well, first of all, thank you for having me on the show. And excellent episode yesterday with Paul and James. I enjoyed it tremendously.
Yeah.
So conspiracy theory is, or conspiracism is an overarching view of the world, of society, of politics, to the effect that humanity is controlled by malevolent forces, either in government, in politics. Some conspiracy theories even involve extraterrestrial forces. But some of those theories have evolved more recently in more recent decades. So conspiracy theory.
Is that the lizard people?
You mean like David Icke and the shape-shifting reptilians? Yeah, that's what I'm referring to. So I've encountered over the years many individuals and organizations that promote various conspiracy theories. And I have to say, I consider myself fortunate that by then I was already well acquainted with the work of Ayn Rand and with objectivism. So I felt a little bit inoculated to some of the extreme nonsense out there. But actually, conspiracy theories have been around very, very long. We're more aware of them now with social media, and particularly in recent years since the lockdowns. But they've been around for a long time. Apparently, even during the American Civil War, there were some suspicions that the British were meddling on one side or the other. And then I think where the term, at least according to the Oxford English Dictionary, where the term conspiracy theory first came from was in an op-ed article responding to or critiquing some of these views that the British were meddling in the Civil War. Now, Mark, I know you've done a lot of reading in American history. Have you ever come across any of those ideas?
I haven't, but I hate to fall in line with the conspiracy theorists. It's entirely possible, given the nation state attitude of I think diplomacy at the time, where it's about national dominance. It's very possible that they could have been meddling in our affairs. At least I could see it as a possibility. They certainly did it during the Revolutionary War when they had more of an interest in whether or not we stayed within the British Empire or not. And so I could see them using slavery and the institution of slavery, and even some of the more rebellious independent Southerners who were fighting against the Union to sow more chaos. The communists certainly have been doing it in the 20th century, even though many people have relegated some of those activities to the conspiracy theory status. A lot of that was actually real.
Well, you just mentioned the communists. It's interesting that considering that so many conspiracy theories today take on a strong anti-government perspective, conspiracies have actually been used by totalitarian governments in the 20th century, both by the Nazis and by Soviet Russia. The Nazis, for example, had a lot of anti-Jewish conspiracy theories to the effect that Jews were going for global dominance, that they were killing children, eating children. And some of the anti-Semitic conspiracy theories still persist up to the present. There's still theorists who take seriously the protocols of the Elder of Zion and nonsense that's been discredited many, many times over the decades. All of the Stalinist show trials of the 1930s had a strong element of conspiracism as well. We know, and Nicolas has talked about this, that tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of innocent people were arrested and charged with being enemies of the state. They were tortured into making grotesque confessions. Their loved ones were threatened, and they made confessions saying, yes, I'm an enemy of the people. I've done these horrible things. I've collaborated with fascists and imperialists. And it was all completely nonsense. It was all completely arbitrary and based on nothing. So conspiracies have actually been a tool used by totalitarian governments to control their people throughout much of the 20th century.
And could I also add to that, in America, we had sort of the reverse perspective where actual conspiracies were claimed to be conspiracy theories, and people who were uncovering these conspiracies, like McCarthy, for example, who I think gets he's not a great man, but he certainly gets, I think, the butt end of history, because he really was uncovering something that was real within the United States government, and that was the infiltration of communist sympathizers and actual agents for communists, for Russia, in the government of the United States. Now, it went and spread far and wide into the Committee on Un-American Activities, which also began to investigate citizens and their political affiliations, many of whom were, in fact, card-carrying communists. There is a book by a former communist by the name of David Horowitz, who grew up in communism, called is it called Fortunate Son? I think it's called Fortunate Son. Maybe confusing the title, but he talks about the level of communist infiltration into just working class populations and the intelligentsia, and how many of these people were instrumental in passing on the types of information that, for example, led to the assassination of Trotsky in Mexico. And if you watch the movie Running on Empty, it's about that very sort of same thing, these networks of real conspiracists who are keeping this couple from the law after they bombed a place, and I don't remember if it resulted in a death, but these conspiracies actually existed and are relegated to the conspiracy theory slot by, I guess, sympathizers. But it's become popular that McCarthyism was sort of a fake. It was sort of a fraud. It was sort of the use of government, overstepping of government power to attack a monster that didn't exist, right? Arthur Miller's Crucible is about the witch hunt of McCarthyism. So what do you say to that, when in our country, actual conspiracies are existing, but they're being relegated to conspiracy theory status?
Well, you mentioned McCarthyism and you mentioned the Crucible. One thing we've often heard in recent years is about the communist infiltration of Hollywood in the 40s and 50s. The screenwriters, the actors. There have even been some films on the subject in recent years. Can you give us a little bit of an inside Hollywood perspective on how that was viewed, or how that's viewed today within Hollywood, that the connection between communism and the screenwriters?
Well, I can tell you this, that when Elia Kazan got his honorary Oscar, or maybe it was the Cecil B. DeMille Award, it was given to him by Martin Scorsese, one of the greatest American directors of all time. There were a number of people in the audience, Ed Harris included, who refused to stand and applaud for him because he testified before the Committee on Un-American Activities. The reason he did it was because the Communist Party was trying to manipulate the artistic material that he was putting out in the world. They were trying to control him. Now, Kazan came from a famous theater in America called the Group Theater, which was around from 1930 to 1941. And the Group Theater turned out some of the greatest directors and acting teachers of America. They basically brought Stanislavski's technique to America, modified it in their own unique ways, and ended up educating the likes of Brando and De Niro and Pacino and Meryl Streep. These teachers were in a theater company, this Group Theater, which identified itself as an ideologically cemented collective. And one of their very good actors, who became a very famous writer, Clifford Odets, was very much in sympathy with communism and socialism. And I think they all more or less became communists, socialists in sympathy, and even card carrying, and attempted to bring those ethics to all of the theater that they were producing, and later on carried that into their teaching of people. So it saturated Hollywood. And I think Rand even talks about, the blacklist against the communists having far less impact than Hollywood claims it to have, and continues to maintain a myth that it ruined so many people's lives, when there was actually a conservative blacklist that was far worse and actually did ruin people's lives. So I know that, socialist sympathies run deep in Hollywood. because it's in line with the dominant ethics, and it takes a lot of thinking to disassociate yourself from that. And actors aren't really known for that kind of thinking. So I would say yes, we get saturated with pro-socialist, pro-altruist, anti-individualist messages all the time. They may not know that consciously that that's what they're doing, but that's what they are doing.
Is it safe to say that where conspiracism really enters the popular imagination was in the wake of the Kennedy assassination? There were all sorts of rumors that the CIA had been involved, criticisms of the Warren Report. And of course, then some decades later, even Oliver Stone's film, which fleshes out some of the theories that were popular at the time. Was that really a watershed moment in conspiracy theories becoming more mainstream, or at least better known in the general culture?
I get the sense that it might have been, yeah, because a lot of journalists and academics point to the assassination of Kennedy as the death of our innocence as a people. That may be hyperbole, but it's certainly a watershed moment for America. And there, whenever information is hidden from the public, as so much of the information surrounding the Kennedy assassination was locked down and sealed for, what was it, 75 years, or enough for that current generation, to maybe a generation after them, to pass away, it starts to generate, I think, honest questions, and of course, our imaginations can take us in a lot of directions, because we presume that these people in power are not only omniscient, but omnipotent. And we begin to develop imaginary scenarios based around their omnipotence. And of course, Kennedy had his fingers in a lot of pies that were very corrupt, and created a lot of political and personal enemies through his irrationalism, through his dabbling, his pragmatism, if you want to call it. He truly did engage the mafia to assist him in gaining votes in Illinois. He really did try to assassinate Fidel Castro and earn the ire of not only Fidel Castro, but also the Cubans that he abandoned in the Bay of Pigs. And he really was having an affair with an East German spy. He really was doing things that open all kinds of doors for people with big imaginations to connect dots that may not be there, or in some respects may. But I think certainly that became the most popular conspiracy theory, and continues to this day, even after Vincent Bugliosi's book, which I thought put that matter to complete rest. But I still hear people talking about it all the time.
Getting to some of the philosophical implications, there's one respect in which I have to say I'm, if not exactly sympathetic, then at least understanding of people who embrace some of these different forms of conspiracism. If you look around at the world today, and if you look at the systematic corruption, the rottenness of our educational institutions, our cultural institutions, our political institutions, if you don't understand the power of ideas, which most people don't understand how philosophical principles drive history, how they drive human action. If you don't have that kind of understanding, it's easy to see all the corruption in the world and think evil must be metaphysically powerful, and all of the different forms of corruption that we see must be part of some underlying plot, some underlying sinister, coordinated, deliberate plot. And we know that that's false, but I can see how people who don't understand the role of principles in human history might actually come to that conclusion.
But I also say this: the greater sympathy towards centralization of everything inspires smaller and smaller groups of people to organize cartels. And these cartels do, in fact, conspire with each other to fix the game, to rig the game in their favor. Now, there seems to be more, I think the response to that is to do more of it, to think that we need to fix the cartels by creating something stronger or putting a strong man in there. So I do think that in some respects, it's easy when you look at organizations like the World Economic Forum, where large business organizations are colluding with large government organizations to come up with policies. And now these aren't behind closed doors, they're outright saying what their intentions are. Well, that collusion is a form of conspiracy. Now, because they're saying it out loud, it might not be considered a conspiracy anymore, but it was happening behind closed doors before that for a long time. So I would say that the increasing centralization of power in a smaller and smaller group of people does lend itself to the idea that evil is very powerful, even though they won't make the integration that they're ceding that power to these folks. They're giving up that power to these folks, and that the solution is to take it back, not to cede more of it.
And by the way, I want to recommend to our viewers, there's a very good article by Ben Bayer on this subject. It's an article that was published in the New Ideal Live in 2018, and it has a title like An Alternative to Conspiracism's Foolish Illusions. And perhaps our producer Daniel could kindly look up that article and put it in the description for this video. But in that article, Ben Bayer makes a couple of interesting points. He says that actual conspiracies, and we know that there have been real conspiracies, whether it's Watergate or whatever, there have been actual conspiracies. They actually have fairly limited power and fairly limited reach. And they're always ultimately, or in most cases, they're exposed by somebody's incompetence or some dishonesty. But he just distinguishes those from the actual conspiracy theories of people like David Icke, where there's this shadow government that's controlling all the different governments of the world and pulling all the strings, which a conspiracy like that would probably involve hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people. And how could something like that possibly be kept secret?
Right, but some of the things you have to think about, here I am being devil's advocate for something like that, is that oftentimes they're not secret, they're right out in the open. It's just that nobody's really talking about it or integrating the facts. I mean, the fact that I think it was unfortunately a Steve Bannon, I mean, I say unfortunately because he's a traditionalist nationalist and believes in exactly the wrong types of principles to help America become great again, to use their own terminology. But he sort of was the one who coined the term the deep state. And there's something to this massive unelected bureaucracy of people that make the majority of laws, that they have both legislative and executive power. There's something to attacking this permanent element of government that is not subject to popular oversight, and getting rid of it, because that again is a truth. I think it's a fact that this entity exists, and that they pass the number of laws that they do, and that lends itself again to the kinds of imaginative explanations that many times go off the rails and endow them with more power than they have. But what we have to do is sort of eliminate these concentrations of power that make people sort of think in the directions of conspiracy theories. What do you think of that? Did that make sense?
Yeah, that makes absolute sense. I think it's interesting that conspiracism is something that transcends boundaries, political boundaries, class boundaries. There is a kind of a perception that people who believe in conspiracy theories tend to be of the lower economic, lower education class. But there are, and I know some very intelligent and highly educated people who do believe in these theories. And there are conspiracy theories that come from the left end of the spectrum as well as from the right end of the political spectrum. Having said that, many of these sort of overarching conspiracy theories, particularly the ones that are sort of anti-government, a lot of them come from the anarchist or libertarian end of the political spectrum, which I find quite interesting. Also, some of the conspiracy theorists or promoters of conspiracy theories that I've come across actually cite Ayn Rand as an influence or quote extensively from her work. Now, very often they quote her out of context or they misinterpret her, but I find it interesting that they are aware of her work and in many cases view her work favorably. Not so much her work on metaphysics and epistemology, which of course they do the exact opposite, but at least they take some of her political pronouncements, her ideas about the nature of government, they'll take those out of context and use them for whatever cultural influence they may have.
That's frightening. That's frightening. That's like Republicans that cite Ayn Rand and or The Fountainhead or Atlas Shrugged as their favorite book, and then Rand gets smeared by association with some of their policies, which are pragmatic. We have a couple super chats. Jonathan Honig for $9.99. Thank you, Jonathan. It's always great to see you up there as a supporter of the show. Christopher Smith with $2.99 Canadian. Thank you, sir. I don't know how much that translates into American dollars, but we appreciate you. Appreciate your presence online as well. So conspiracy theories have been with us for a very, very long time. And there are what are some conspiracies? Can you think of any off the top of your head that are happening right now as we speak that are popular? I know there's QAnon, which is one massive right-wing idea. But tell me, can you tell me of any more that are going on today?
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned QAnon. Do you really think of QAnon as a massive conspiracy? I think of QAnon as something relatively minor that has been thrust into prominence merely by virtue of the association with Donald Trump. I want to make an analogy here. In one of Ayn Rand's essays, Extremism or the Art of Smearing, she talks about the John Birch Society, which she describes as a sort of a confused, befuddled organization, which suddenly became famous because it was being discussed by all these Republicans at some national conventions, but not owing to any merits or any importance of their own, but they were just thrust into prominence. I tend to see QAnon in a similar sort of light. I see it, even by the standards of normal conspiracy theories, I see it very much on the fringe, very much as a minority phenomenon. But because of the connection with Donald Trump, it's been held up by the media and it's been blown out of proportion. Would you agree with that? Or do you actually see QAnon as something that's important on the stage today?
Yeah, I don't know enough about QAnon to say, but I do think that whenever the left picks up an issue, it's usually hyperbole. They usually do try to make more of it than exists. Like they try to make the power of the white supremacists so overarchingly evil and dominant in society, when it's really very fringy and not taken seriously by 99.999% of white people. There are far more deadly groups of human beings out there that are doing a lot more damage to society. And I would say primarily some of those people are academics, and the types of ideas that they're seeding into our young people's minds that are causing cancerous deterioration of their epistemological capability. They're far more dangerous than any white supremacist or MS-13 gang member or mafioso or Blood or Crip. They are killing the spirit and thinking capacity of our youth, and that's pretty crazy. But now we have interesting conspiracy theories. I think I think the 1619 Project is an attempt. This attempt to reframe history with slavery at its center and as the cause of and source of the American Revolution and capitalism itself. Now, because it's out in the open and openly states its point of view, I don't know if it could be considered a conspiracy, but it certainly is an attempt by a group of people to do something nefarious, to put one over on the population and to reframe arguments in a way that has a feel of conspiracy to it, does it not? Since there's so many people complicitous in this.
It does feel like a conspiracy, except as you say, it's taking place right in the open, right in plain sight. But I often think, the world is not being destroyed by shape-shifting reptilians, but rather by woke professors spouting postmodernist dogmas.
Indeed. So conspiracy theories happen. Now we talked about what they were and how long they've been around. The majority of the time you would say, in reference to Ben Baer's article, they come from a specific frame of reference with respect to the way the world works and with respect to the power of evil. I don't know if we've talked enough about that. Do you want to start to fill those gaps in a little bit more for us?
There's definitely a strong sense of malevolence to most of these conspiracy theories. The idea that humanity is a sort of blind, powerless herd, that we don't have control over our destinies. Well, we discussed this a little bit before we went live on air, that a lot of these ideas are motivated by a feeling of powerlessness. a feeling that we're being led in a certain direction by our political class, our political elites, our educational elites. And it's a kind of a protest against that, a kind of a protest against this perceived powerlessness. But again, we have a particular perspective on this, that the world is really being destroyed by ideas that almost everybody accepts and agrees with. Ideas about altruism, collectivism, statism. And you made the point earlier that we actually cede a lot of our power to governments, which make it possible for them to take society in a particular direction.
Would you say the collusion between the FBI and social media was a conspiracy, an in fact conspiracy, which for a long time was promoted by the right as something that existed and the left laughed at?
I don't know. Is that something that was then proven to be true? That was proven to be factual?
I think they were taking their marching orders from the FBI, and they received, I think, a certain amount of funding from the FBI and followed what they said. I don't necessarily think that's bad. I think they were trusting the intelligence agency's integrity, and simply, when the police tell you to do something, it's a little hard to resist, I imagine, or it inspires a certain amount of fear to resist doing what they tell you to do. But it seems like they were more or less an arm of the state, and the FBI was telling them to do pretty much what the government wanted them to do, and inhibiting the voices of the people the government felt uncomfortable with. That seems like a conspiracy that's now come to light, and perhaps there's some legitimacy to it. What say you?
Yeah, that does sound like a conspiracy. And of course, when conspiracies are proven to be true, that just adds fuel to the fire. Then the theorists, the conspiracists say, aha, well, there's one conspiracy that was proven to be true. And they use this as part of their confirmation bias to prove that perhaps other conspiracies are true as well. Anytime there's a major crisis in the world, usually that brings about more of these conspiracy theories as a way of trying to make sense of it. We could, for example, talk about the proliferation of conspiracy theories in the wake of 9/11, or even more recently, as a result of the various coronavirus lockdowns, the various theories having to do with vaccinations, with Bill Gates. Well, perhaps let's talk a little bit about that, about the anti-vax movement and some of the conspiracy theories that have emerged in the past 3 years.
Now, yes, so certainly there's a huge movement on the right, and I don't know if I'll be able to exactly articulate their perspective. Some of them, they come from multiple perspectives, actually. Some just don't like the idea that vaccinations were mandated. They are suspicious of anything the government mandates people to do, because they think if it were good, it wouldn't need to be mandated. And there's a certain degree of rationality to that. And then there's people down the spectrum who think there was nanotechnology that was placed in the vaccines, the purpose of which is to, God knows what, control us in some way or another. Others thought it was a type of gene therapy that they were imposing on the rest of us, possibly for the same reason. And then there's the big pharma angle, that there were much simpler solutions to the coronavirus problem in ivermectin and some of the other simple treatments that people on the right claimed were pretty much foolproof. But big pharma had invested in this new type of technology, and they wanted to move forward with it in collusion with the government. And there's enough craziness around this topic to lend some credence to the conspiracies, because the people in the know, the Faucis, right, the Centers for Disease Control, were constantly changing their perspectives and telling us from week to week, pushing the bar to different degrees. And the government itself, we need to flatten curves. We only need 2 weeks. Now we need longer. 2 weeks turned into 2.5 years, and some of those mandates still are not being released by state governments. So it does lend credence to this idea that the state is doing something nefarious. We don't know exactly what, so we'll plant our own notions of what it is, but we know that they want one thing from us: control. We know that Klaus Schwab, or whatever his name is, from the World Economic Forum, said this is a great opportunity for an economic reset. And that lends even more fuel to the fire. Look, they're trying to break down society. They're trying to crush capitalism. They're trying to bring us to the point of absolute subordination to the state so they can rush in this new economic idea of central planning on top of us. Now, there seems to be credence to that too. So what say you to all this? I know I've thrown probably a crow epistemology at you, but hopefully we can get through a few of these birds.
Well, one thing that comes to mind is consider how the authorities and the social media, how they responded to the so-called alternative theories about the coronavirus. They tried to suppress them. They branded that as that's all misinformation. We have to silence these people. We have to ridicule these people, rather than examining the arguments objectively. No, anything that's misinformation, we have to deplatform these people. We have to silence these people, which ended up only making them look like martyrs in certain situations. It actually added more fuel to the fire. Suppressing certain theories only made them more powerful in certain circles.
Like Obi-Wan Kenobi, when he says, when he talks about dying, it'll only make him stronger. It's true, and it feeds these conspiracies. And then, as many people on the right like to say, what was a conspiracy last year is now becoming true this year. So, conspiracies as a malevolent universe perspective of trying to identify what's going on in the world and connecting dots that aren't really there and creating narratives are now becoming actual facts in many ways, right? As I said, as we continue to centralize power, these centralized forces begin to collude with one another in private, and we're discovering this collusion, and it's giving more force and strength to the idea that, hey, perhaps we have ceded too much control to these people. Now look what's happening. What say you?
Yeah, I agree. And in the case of the more extreme conspiracist ideas, the ones involving some massive conspiracy of bankers, Illuminati, shadow governments, aliens, whatever, do you think there's perhaps an element of primacy of consciousness there? I mean, if we're really getting to the philosophical roots, do you think that some of the people who believe in these theories, they've given up understanding reality, trying to actually perceive reality, and they think it's somehow safer or makes more sense to try to come up with ideas in their own heads? So there's an element of emotionalism, of simply following their feelings rather than actually looking at the world and trying to make sense of what's really happening.
I would say that's dominant in our culture in general. So I wouldn't put it past those people to be submitting to the same kind of error in that respect. But I still think that, centralization of the banking system, for example, when we see them, when we see the way they deal with monetary issues, and you can see that their primary responsibility, fiduciary responsibility, is to themselves, not to the public, not to the people that are not to the people who are banking with them, but to maintaining this sort of house of cards of Keynesian sort of finance. It just makes you think that these groups are conspiring against you, and it lends credence to it to me. We have free trade for 100 Swedish kroner. I find it interesting that conspiracy theorists explain that secret cabals use government's regulatory power to destroy liberty, yet many of them have no interest in reducing regulations. Now, this is true too. Certainly true. Right.
That's a good point. And it's also interesting that many of these conspiracists, they're anti-government. Many of them are anarchists or extreme libertarians. They don't believe in government, but they're also against corporations. They're against big pharma. They're against GMO. And yet they don't see the inherent contradictions there.
But do you think that comes from that what they would call like cartel capitalism or corporate statism? They're confusing capitalism with the fascist state, which is what we have today, right?
Yeah.
The collusion of government and business is not a capitalist state. And so what Big Pharma really is sort of an arm of these various government institutions, and they're sort of supporting one another. I could see why they would be hostile to them, but they don't necessarily have the right solutions, for sure.
Ultimately, I think this comes down to something that you were discussing yesterday with James and Paul, which is the failure of modern education, the failure of public education, and the failure of higher education. You raise several generations of young people to think there are no facts, there are no principles, there are no absolutes. Just go with your feelings, trust your instincts. And you have a whole generation of people who can't evaluate facts objectively, can't differentiate truth from falsehood. What do you think? What do you expect the results to be? So you have a majority that believes everything they hear on CNN or Fox News, and a minority who said, well, no, that's obviously false. So instead, I'm going to follow David Icke, or I'm going to follow some other alternate theory.
It's crazy. We live in a world of where the alternatives are primarily irrational. But guess what, folks, for all you viewing today, there is a rational alternative to all this insanity. It's right here at the Daily Objective and at the Ayn Rand Institute, at the Ayn Rand Center UK, where you can introduce yourself to rational philosophy as an antidote to this insanity, because you don't want to get caught up in this, folks. You want to be above it, beyond it, and look through it and past it, and power on to something better than what we're falling into today. Do you have any did we miss? I'm sure we missed tons of stuff with respect to conspiracy theories, but anything significant that pops into your mind now?
I have one final thought. One final thought I want to address. If you look at some of the lists of top conspiracies or lists of popular conspiracy theories, almost always near the top of the list is climate change denial. So there's an example of something that's, well, of course, we don't frame it in terms of denial, but something that's a legitimate perspective, questioning the methodology, the predictions of climate change scientists. That is now put in the same category as shape-shifting reptiles and pedophiles, Satan worshiping rings. How do we frame that, and how do we respond to that?
Yeah, well, I mean, if from a postmodernist world where there is no anchor in objective reality, I think it's very difficult from an objectivist perspective to get through to somebody like that, right? I mean, who can't distinguish between facts and imagination, or can't distinguish between opinions because they have no anchor in objective reality. And in the only anchor they do have as their barometer of truth is the tribe that they belong to. So it's very much primacy of consciousness, as you talked about earlier, this societal-wide second-handedness where they're all relying upon the authority of the tribe to tell them what the truth is, as opposed to standing alone as an individual and seeing what the facts are. So I'm not sure unless you have a solution that I'm not sure of. I don't know how you combat that except by a slow reassertion of the value of reality, of proper epistemology, logic, reason as primacy, as the primary attributes of humanity. Reasserting those values into the culture, I think, is a long-term project, but I think it's the only way you're going to combat it, unless you can think of something that's sort of a steroid shot, one of those, some pretty bumper sticker length concept that everybody could wrap their heads around that defeats this. Can you?
I don't know about a bumper sticker, but I always think there must be people out there who believe or subscribe to these various conspiracist ideas. There must be some better people out there, people who are a little more intelligent, a little more willing to use their eyes and perceive what's going on. I hope eventually they find this channel. I hope they find this philosophy, and I hope they are inspired to start working on their own epistemologies, putting their own ideas in order, and hopefully abandon some of that malevolence, leave that behind, and embrace the benevolence that we have to offer and some of the ideas that we have to offer.
Yeah, what a great note to end on. Yes, objectivism is a philosophy of benevolence, not just of a benevolent universe, meaning it's comprehensible to us, but also rational egoism as the only means of benevolently interacting with not only yourself, but with other people around you. So I really do hope that people do get this. Well, it's been a pleasure talking to you, Nicholas. I hope we mined it for all that it was worth. If not, we can come back and do it. Or if you have anything more to say, I don't know how to end it on a better note than you just did. It's been a joy talking to you as usual. I really appreciate you.
Thank you for having me, Mark. I appreciate it.
And there are, yes, indeed. And there are no upcoming shows, folks, but thank you for watching The Daily Objective. Come back again every single day to watch a show on a different topic. We are brought to you by the Ayn Rand Center UK. And I just remind you all, have good, healthy premises. Peace.